to others, just the added respect that developers deserve and don't often get. My name is Gaurav Khetrapal. I'm here to talk about a very unusual topic. Salesforce1 meets Avengers, a fun way of understanding App Cloud mobile integrations. As I was going through the booklet and the agenda, I realized I have the longest title name, but unfortunately it's a short session, so we'll try and stay on track. So this is what I plan to cover over the next 25 minutes. You'll see a lot of visuals. A lot of it is due to the fact that since childhood I've been a Marvel fan. I wanted to be Spiderman when I grew up. That didn't happen, so the next best thing that happened is that I work on Salesforce. So we'll start with some concepts around third-party API integrations. We'll talk about what is the App Cloud mobile SDK. We'll talk about gamification and how specifically it relates to Salesforce. We'll take a look at how Marvel API works and how do we integrate that into Salesforce. We'll do a somewhat deeper dive into the what, why, and how of integrations. We'll talk about some key use cases. And then we come to the fun part where we actually mash up Salesforce and Marvel API. This is more of comicification because these are all Marvel characters. So it's not exactly gamification, but yeah, we'll comicify Salesforce. And finally, we'll try and see if it works. And we wrap it up with a short recap of the key concepts. So before we start, I just want to do a sampling of the audience. How many of us here are developers? Okay. So developers, I mean, the first rule of being a developer is it's not a bug, it's a feature. How many of us here are iOS developers? Okay, a few. So yeah, I mean, being an iOS developer is cool, and I've been working as an iOS developer for a very long time, but it's very taxing on your pocket. So most of the iOS developers, although they love doing iOS development, they still only afford Android phones. How many of us here are Marvel fans? Okay, yeah, so as I said, my childhood dream didn't quite get fulfilled, but I've been a Marvel fan since forever. A quick introduction about myself. I've kind of grown old working in the Salesforce ecosystem. I started off in 2007. Salesforce has been kind, and they chose me as a Salesforce MVP and a developer success story. I am one of the moderators on the official developer forums. I lead a developer user group in the city of Jaipur. It's also called the Pink City, one of the most happening tourist places in India. And I'm an active contributor on Stack Exchange, and you can always find me there answering questions on mobile topics. Okay, so let's start. Building API integrations is often very hard. Salesforce makes it somewhat easier because there is a well-defined interface. So if you treat your force.com data model as your MBAS or the mobile backend as a service, all you are essentially doing is you are doing some HTTP calls between your application and the data model. So it could be get, put, post, delete, and these are typically what we call the CRUD operations. So you could be creating data, you could be updating data, you could be deleting records, or you could be just reading data. Again, generic concept, there are two ways to build a API integration. This is one of the best examples I've found to describe the SOAP versus the REST debate. So SOAP used to be a very popular standard till a few years back. So if Martin Lawrence is your actual data payload, the SOAP standards are so heavy, and the XML headers, they actually converted into a big mama and then it's sent to the server. No surprise that it's not used very prominently any longer. In comparison, REST is what the payload should actually be. It's just your data in a lightweight format such as JSON, and then over to the server. So most of the mobile integrations that are built in Salesforce, they do follow the REST standards. Okay, so talking about the Salesforce App Cloud iOS SDK. As I said, I started off around 10 years back when this SDK did not exist. And since then, it's existed, but it's kind of gone through multiple names. So earlier, it used to be called the Salesforce Mobile SDK. A few years later, it was called the Force.com Mobile SDK. Then it used to be called the Salesforce1 SDK, and now it's finally called the App Cloud SDK. But I hope there are no Salesforce people here. Over the years, the core thing remains the same. It's an SDK. It's a third-party library which you can use to build applications. Just the marketing paradigm around it has changed. So what does it exactly provide? Like any third-party SDK, it's meant to make developers' lives easier. So it provides a number of built-in functionalities so that you don't need to reinvent the wheel. So for example, there is a OAuth 2 dance built into it, so you need not take care of the authentication by yourself. There are API wrappers, so you can fire your SOQL queries directly using the SDK. And if you're building hybrid apps, which means you're using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, there is a built-in app container which allows you to run those web technologies in a container and it still function as an app. And then there are a lot of mobile-centric use cases. Offline has emerged as a very popular mobile use case in the last few years. And then there is support for push notifications as well. The beauty of the SDK is that if you look at the overall Salesforce architecture, it fits right on top of everything. So you can kind of leverage everything through the APIs. And we'll look at it when we get to the code. Again, as I said, there are two ways essentially in which you can build App Cloud integrations. One is that you use native technologies. For example, if you're doing iOS, you use something like Objective-C or Swift to write your apps. And Android, you use Java. The advantage here is that there are advanced UI interactions. It's running natively. The performance is much faster. If you are a web developer and you want to use your existing skills, you use the hybrid approach and you use a framework such as Cordova to package it up. Okay. One of the key drivers for me building this framework called Marvelforce was just to explore the gamification aspects and what can possibly be done within the Salesforce ecosystem. Gamification has been on the rise in the software industry over the last few years, but enterprise you typically don't consider as a taker for gamification. That has actually changed because of several reasons. Gamification has a number of advantages when it comes to driving your own sales teams or marketing teams. It motivates people and drives participation and adoption. It's often used by companies as a tool to increase efficiency, meet customer expectations, and finally drive profits. There is actually a bunch of gamification apps on the App Exchange. There is a separate category for gamification. Salesforce has actually produced a sample app called the Chatter game. It's again open source. I highly recommend looking at it if you're planning to build something on your own. Okay, so Marvel, apart from all the characters that they produce, they've actually done a pretty good job of building an API, which actually lets developers use and build some fancy applications. The way you use the API is that you go to their website, which is the developer.marvel.com. You register for an account. It typically gives you a couple of things, a public key and a private key. The public key is the one that you use to hit the API and get data out. So, and then there is a fairly good developer documentation. There are APIs for everything. So for example, if you want to see what all characters are available, there is an API for that. If you want to dig deeper and look at all the comics for a particular character, there is an API for that. There are APIs for stories, events, a lot of other things, and we'll see how we use these. So just to show how the API works, this is an account which I registered. This is a test account. So this is the API keys, those I get. And then this is the documentation. So for example, if I want to see what all characters does this API support, if I hit it without any parameters, it will show me all of them. But since I want it to be Spiderman, so let's look at Spiderman. And then it returns a lot of data about Spiderman, who Spiderman is, all of the comics that Spiderman has, stories of Spiderman, series that Spiderman has. And we'll come to how these are used in the app. demo we have already seen for the API. Okay, so how do we integrate these APIs along with the App Cloud iOS SDK? So as I said, the iOS SDK provides two ways of doing things. You can do it natively or you can do it hybrid. I actually built sample apps for both these approaches, but due to scarcity of time, I'm going to just focus on the native app. And then I built a small watchOS API integration as well. So let's talk about the native integration. Some of the use cases which I thought through were, these are all contacts. So by default, Salesforce would return you the information about a contact, and then you can look at the details of that contact. But what I wanted to do was a little more fun. So what we are doing here is we are associating a random Marvel character with each of the contacts, and then that information about that character also gets associated with the contact. Something else related to the gamification part, a lot of salespeople usually get a lot of tasks which they need to complete. So we associate a badge with each task, and once that person completes that particular task, they get that badge. And then those badges kind of show up on their profile as they go on completing more tasks. Again, one of the other use cases was Chatter. When Chatter launched, it was dubbed as Facebook for the enterprise. It's still a very valuable tool, but I mean the reality is that it's the Facebook of nowhere. So, and I personally do not like the Chatter interface. So, I built a small utility around it where once you send out a message, it adds a bit of a personality to it. So, it can add a character, it can add a storyline to it, and makes your sales meeting interesting. Okay, so before we go to the hybrid part, let's actually do a demo. The overall project structure, and this is a little bit technical for iOS developers, you would still use Xcode. Once you install the SDK, it's installed as a pre-built framework, and your overall project structure would still remain the same. Whatever the SDK provides, the Salesforce SDK core, these libraries would be pre-installed as part of your package. And when you create a new project, you'll get the default classes like the initial view controller, the root view controller. Let me just launch it, and then we'll come back to the code. So I'm launching it on an emulator. Not a very secure password. So once I launch it, as I said in the previous slide, authentication is actually taken care of the Salesforce Mobile SDK. So whatever the login screen that we saw, the permissions, that this is all handled by the SDK. As a developer, I don't need to worry about this. If I grant the permission, then it's where the control is actually passed on to me, and that's where my initial view controller comes into play. So these are all the contacts. What I've essentially done is hit the Marvel API to get all the characters, their images, their names, and then assigned each of my contacts a random name. So let's look at maybe Miller. Not a very friendly character, but then I can go in and I can kind of read more details about him. I can look at the stories associated with this character. I can even look at what all comics he's featured in. So he's featured in Hulk and a few others. And then these are some of the tasks that are assigned to me, which are either I've not started or these are in progress, but I've not completed them. So let me just try and mark one of my tasks as completed. So once I do this, it shows the task has been completed, and it assigned me a badge. I can't really figure out which character. Yeah, Ajax's badge is assigned. And when I go to my profile, I had some badges earlier, so it adds that particular badge to my profile. The other thing, chatter, as I said, we can so in a conference, I actually one of my favorite speakers actually said in a demo, if it doesn't crash, it's hard coded. But that's not the case here. So it's a simple message, but again, if we want to Marvelify it or we want to comicify it, it adds a bit of character. And once I post this, assuming it doesn't crash, okay, it says it posted on the wall. So we can just go here. If I refresh my chatter, yeah, so it kind of worked. Okay, and then I just built a more of an informational tab. This is basically getting all the information about Marvel. Let's maybe look for any of the characters, 3D man. Then again, the same thing. You can go into details and look at all the information, events, stories. There's a lot of information available about each of the characters. So the idea is that you use the Salesforce API and the Marvel API together. Just to give an example, this particular list that we saw, we are essentially getting the name of the contact and then an image from the Marvel API. So the way this is done is that I'm using the SF REST API, which is the API wrapper provided by the mobile SDK, and then I'm getting a couple of things. I'm getting the name, the ID, and the photo URL from contact. And the way I'm setting this photo ID is I'm hitting the Marvel API. I'm getting all the characters, their IDs, their names, and photographs in a JSON dictionary, and then I randomly assign it to each character. So that's in a nutshell. And then we have view controllers for each of these. So for example, we have a view controller for chatter, we have a view controller for tasks, all of them. So going back, similarly, I built a very simple hybrid app which displays kind of similar things, gets the images, retrieves contacts from Salesforce, assigns them, and then it has that task and badge functionality as well. WatchOS, I mean, if you are an iOS developer and have done WatchOS stuff, it's a little more complicated than building an app for an iPhone and an iPad. So I just built a subset of this functionality where I implemented the tasks, and then you can go on a task screen, detail, and then see what all that task needs to do, mark it as complete, and then you'll be assigned a badge. The code for all of these projects is available on my GitHub repository. This is primarily what I meant to cover. I just want to do a quick recap of the key concepts. There are two ways to build API integration, SOAP versus REST. REST is the preferred approach because it's lightweight and performant. There is a SDK available. You can call it the Salesforce Mobile SDK, the Force.com Mobile SDK, or the App Cloud SDK. Again, there are two ways to build it. You can go native, or you can use a hybrid approach, and you can also build WatchOS apps. A good place to get started is the Salesforce iOS SDK GitHub repo. You can clone the repository, you can run some sample projects, and then build your own stuff. Marvel API, which is developer.marvel.com, and then these three applications that I have talked about are all open source. So I think that's what I plan to cover. Do not be scared of this character. It's not meant to stop you from asking questions. So if you have any questions, please.
Thanks, first of all. I was just wondering what your views are on which route to go down, whether it be hybrid or native or build off SF1.
It all comes down to your requirements and the use cases. Personally, I'm not a big fan of Salesforce 1, especially when you have to use device features like location, camera. It's possible to do it within Salesforce 1, but it makes you much harder. And then there are a lot of constraints which determine what you can do and you cannot do when you're using Salesforce 1. Between native and hybrid, it all comes down to performance of the app. If you want to build an application where user experience is the key, you can get, to a certain extent, you can get performance with a hybrid application, but it cannot match the fluid transitions that you typically get in a native app. And again, if your app is using a lot of heavy-duty stuff like accelerometer and all other device features, then native is the preferred way, because hybrid, you're still going through a translation bridge, so that kind of makes it heavier, and it shows on the app's performance. So Simon walked in as we were showing the giant on the screen, and he was. Any more questions? All right, thank you. I hope you enjoyed the session and have a wonderful conference. Thank you.